All right. And so hello and welcome to NFCP September Sanctions Update. Hopefully you know this already, but if not, my name is Louie Vargas and I'll be your host for this session. We haven't met for a few months due to the summer break in the EU, and as you could imagine, there's a lot to cover today, which explains our expanded session. Usually, we try to do 30 to 40 minutes, but now we'll try to cover everything within an hour. We can't promise. Before we get started, some quick notes and housekeeping reminders. Thank you to all our members and LinkedIn followers. Thank you to all of our collaborators. Special thank you to all of our participants, our panel of experts, I should say, and our special guest, and all attendees. So you who are joining the call and who will watch this later. And just want to give everybody a heads up. Those that are not participating, please turn off your cameras and remain on mute. If we have time for Q&A later on, and once you're selected, you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you like, not mandatory. And remember, a bit of a reminder, everything we discussed today is for informational purposes only. So do not consider this legal advice. Please contact your internal compliance or legal teams if you need specific advice or guidance. And I already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared afterwards via our LinkedIn page. And if you're a member, you will receive an email with the link as well. Okay, so without further ado, let's introduce our sanctions panel of experts. If you've joined us before, there's no new faces except for our special guests. So a quick rundown is Andrew Viloria, who's an NFC collaborator and he'll be covering the US and OFAC. We have Ian Bolton, who's the founder and CEO of Sanctions SOS, covering the UK and OSCE. We also have Mark Handley. He's a partner at Duane Morris, covering the EU, and also pretty much giving us an umbrella view for the rest of the world on enforcement actions. And then we have Aleksi Pursiainen, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, who's a CEO at Solid Plan Consulting covering the Nordics. And our special guest for today, very happy to have her, Luma Zitani, who's a senior manager at Accenture UK, and she'll be giving us an update on Syria. So let's kick things off. So over to you, Luma.
Yeah, thanks, Louie, and thanks for inviting me and to join your panel this round and talk about something that I think anyone who has been over the last, I would say over the last 10 months, but I would say Syria has been pretty much high on the agenda since the last 14 years, would have had to mention that word at least once a day, if not more frequently. Just a bit of a background and a caveat. So I'm a senior manager at Accenture, 5.5 years there. I come from a banking industry where I spent my whole career doing sanctions, sectoral sanctions. I've navigated Arab Spring, Russia 1, 2, and 3, and now Syria. I'm originally from Syria, so the topic is close to and dear to my heart for a personal reason, not just from a professional point of view. Everything I'm saying here is a personal opinion, has no reflection on a professional standing of the company or any affiliation I work with. So cutting the fun legal stuff out of the way. A bit of context, Syria went through a major internal disruption kicking off 14 years ago. Civil upheaval, fairly brutally clamped down over 14 years. With everything that you can imagine, from brute force, from airstrikes, from chemical weapons by the Assad regime against the population of Syria. In a country of 22 million people, we have almost 50% of the population getting displaced internally and externally, massive wave, massive destruction. All that event has triggered quite an expansive set of sanction regime that was introduced by EU, UK, all major G7 countries, United Nations, and of course the US. And those have kind of continued to progressively become more and more restrictive until come later on from the US, we got the Caesar Act, which effectively put the big scary stick of secondary sanctions and designation for those materially supporting the Assad regime. And that pretty much locked down most interaction with the country. Then very, very rapidly in 2024, although there was bizarrely some warming of relationship with the EU, with the Assad regime, and there was almost with the Arab League almost trying to re-welcome the regime back into the fold and try to reach some sort of a settlement. A very fast military action by a group of fighters led by HTS which is a prescribed terrorist organization, managed to topple the regime very, very quickly on the 8th of December 2024. That kind of caught everyone off guard because you have suddenly an overnight regime change, luckily with minimal casualties. So the human cost of it has been, considering the background of the last 14 years, comparably could have been worse. But then you suddenly have a set of fresh faces who, a few of them are prescribed terrorist organizations designated at the UN level, Security Council for Terrorism, who are stepping in. And there was a massive desire, very, very noticeable from Western countries, vanguard led by the US, which is quite unusual in those circumstances, to bring them to the fold, to embrace this new government, to set it for success. What that has basically translated into is that in very, very quick succession over the following month, a relaxation, suspensions, seizing, or even revocation of the sanction regime that were in place. The timeline is now, because of the speed and the scale of changes, I'll be rattling for the whole hour just to go for everything that has been removed. But almost, if we are summarizing, starting with the European Union, which led very quickly, they lifted the majority of the economic sanctions against Syria, bit of a phased manner. Initially, they started by removing sectoral sanctions. They moved to delisting some of the key entities. They then moved to allowing for resumption of banking relationship, which was one of the key challenges that the country has faced, and then almost moved it now into just very, very targeted and focused sanctions on individuals who are tied to the previous Assad regime. Interestingly, they've also added some of the individuals from the new guard who have been involved in some of the more recent sectarian violence that we have seen happening in the country. So things haven't settled fully rosily, as well as a continuing arms embargo. In the UK, that kind of followed a similar pathway, slight misalignment with timing, but again, on the majority, there has been a massive relaxation, revocation, or suspension of sanctions or cancellation of sanctions that are applicable on Syria. And in both cohorts, there is quite a strong push that's coming from the government to encourage businesses and banking to resume relationships and reconnect the country back. The amount of diplomatic welcoming that we're seeing with high-profile visits is also rather very, very unusual, as I said, at this time, especially when you consider that you still have people who are technically still require special permission from the Security Council to be able to travel because they're designated by the UN. That is, I think, being worked through at the Security Council as we speak. Now, the biggest player, of course, in the sanction space, what have the US been doing? The US, as I mentioned earlier, has unusually for them, kind of went running ahead, speeding in front of everyone. And there was a famous, I don't know if anyone has seen the news, in May where Trump's first foreign trip was to the Gulf countries, and then he walks up to the podium, unbeknown to any of his administration, to basically say, we'll be removing all sanctions on Syria. And there was quite a funny facial reaction, if anyone eagle-eyed saw the audience, where they were kind of like, and it's funny because even there was quite a lot of outcome from the State Department, from the Treasury Department, say, we're working through the details. There's no details yet. But details followed quite quickly. They terminated the national emergency with respect to Syria in June. Before that, they delisted about 500 plus entities that were designated on OFAC. Of course, before that, they issued a couple of general licenses, which were quite widespread, but not sufficient to encourage that. So that's why they moved into that delisting. The bulk of executive orders that were in place against Syria were waived out. And then the most prominent move, of course, everything above that is quite monumental in the sanctions world. I don't think we've seen a sanction regime unraveling that quickly, especially from the US side, is that export controls that were applicable to Syria and have been applicable to Syria for decades, well before the turbulence of the last 14 years, have been eased off massively. The license exemptions have been expanded. Just to give you a bit of a context, technically you couldn't get anything more than a very low spec Nokia phone into the country because of the restrictions on transfer of technology. Of course, you can, circumvention was rife, so you can get everything there. You'll get the newest iPhone in Syria before you get it in the UK shops, but that now has been revoked. With explicit elements around personal communication device, about aviation for civilian use, and other high level items such as that. That was one of the biggest challenges that impacted any engagement with Syria throughout. So that was basically removed a couple of months ago. What remains are again targeted sanctions against those who are associated with the Assad regime, which is expected, but also remnants of the Caesar Act. So the Caesar Act, which was the big scary stick that was impacting anyone wanting to engage with Syria, has been mostly suspended, with very wide applicable waivers in place to allow for a majority of activities that would have been restricted under the Caesar Act. However, the Caesar Act is a congressional act, so it cannot be suspended or revoked without an equivalent congressional act. There's been a number of attempts. So there was one that didn't then get voted down shortly after the sectarian turbulence trouble in the coastal line. There was very much no political will to try to push that on its own. More recently, they tried to attach it to the national defense and annual budget. As the usual add-on they add to the annual budgeting cycle, where anything that needs cross-party support, let's stick it into the national budget and get it waived. But again, there was a few items that were caught, not the Caesar Act waiver itself, that were causing some uncomfort. So a decision was made, and that was 2 days ago, to we'll strip the annual budget, because we needed to get it through, from anything which is not specifically to do with that. So they've taken it out. So now we're on, I think, attempt 3 to try to get this. And anyone who's familiar with the Congress ways of working appreciate that the amount of political jockeying to get anything through would take a while. But the waivers are in place, and Congress has, because the president has basically put in that technical act of saying we need to be revoking the Caesar Act, and we're waiving the requirements against it. So there will be movement there. The question is for how long. On the side of that, I think also to add, there was adjustment to some of the restrictions on Commercial Bank of Syria, which again predates the last 14 years, and almost an encouragement to say you can deal with the central banks, Commercial Bank of Syria, all of those. A few months ago, there was a very interesting session held with a number of banks, international banks, a cohort of Syrian banks, private and state-owned, the governor of central bank, special envoy to Barak, the US special envoy to Syria, and then you had a representative from the Treasury Department, from FinCEN, from everyone that you can imagine, and the tone was what is needed in order to reactivate the relationship. So they were kind of almost facilitating that. The messaging very clear on, we understand, again, unusual to come from the US. We understand that sanctions are, and the hesitance that still remains is having a significant impact on the recovery of the country, that its ability to accelerate its build and reconstruction, and even the political stability of this new regime, is very much dependent on allowing those commercial flows to go. So there was a very strong political push to try to convince private operators and banks to say, what do you need? We've given you everything we want. Why are you not engaging? I'm conscious that not to take too much time, but I think the one thing I would just add, with sanctions, with Syria, sanctions was never the only thing that was prohibiting or restricting banks' appetite to deal with the country. As I said, we still are on the immediate, we're still dealing with a government and key players who are themselves subject to terrorist designation, albeit suspended, and they're working through the UN to remove. HTS remains a prescribed terrorist organization. So in the UK, there has been quite a significant conversation in that space, but even outside the UK, you still have that UN level designation that needs to be taken into consideration. The country has been rife for drug trade with Kleptagon, kleptocracy, corruption, bad practices for decades. So there's a massive hesitance in the banking sector on understanding the overall financial crime risk profile of the country. It's still on the grey list in FATF, on the high risk, our third country high list for the EU. FATF is still saying, oh, it's too risky for us to go and make an assessment. So all of that means that for banks to establish any kind of a correspondent relationship, which is almost like the first step, the whole long list of that needs to be ticked in terms of the due diligence, the on-site visit, re-establishing relationship with local partners is to do. And there is still a bit of a view, well, we are not seeing the massive business demand to justify us going there. We're seeing is significant demand coming from GCC countries and regional banks there. So for international and global firms, the exposure is probably at the moment contained through secondary exposure through correspondent relationships. If a bank provides euro clearing to a GCC bank, that is then facilitating some sort of activity relating to Syria. And that's where the position is at the moment. We have started seeing some flows. So MoneyGram announced that they're facilitating direct transfer. Interestingly, I know a couple of people who decided, like, I'll risk the £100 and I'll see if the money can get through. They're still working through the details, so it's not there fully. It's a good promising start to that opening. And of course, in the parallel internally, the governor of the central bank he worked in international bodies. He's ex-EY senior partner, so he's very much switched on into what good look like. They're working with the World Bank, with the IMF on infrastructure, upskilling, compliance, revamping regulations frameworks. So the bones of compliance in the country are also being addressed, and that's where we are on Syria.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Luma. Very interesting. And I hope that things continue in that direction with the easing of sanctions and then more business and money flowing through the country to help it rebuild. I know that you have to run, so I just want to thank you again. Please stay as long as you can. But for those that might have questions for her, please share it with us directly and we could get it to her and offer up answers afterwards. Or if you're connected to her on LinkedIn, or if you're not, you could reach out and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer questions there as well. Thanks again, Luma.
No worries.
All right, so moving on with our normal schedule and agenda, we'll hand things over to Andrew.
Thanks, Louie, and thanks, Luma. I think I can provide some additional context why the U.S. was so eager to jump into the revocation of the Syrian sanctions. I think it's because the lifting of sanctions in the U.S. is seen as a victory. And I think that Trump wanted a kind of win, and so he was very gung-ho about lifting the Syrian sanctions. And I think that's the motivation. And then the rest of the administration had to catch up, including OFAC. So generally, anytime sanctions are lifted in the U.S., that's seen as a victory, and people can use that to justify other things. And so I think he wanted that. So yeah, following up on a lot of what you said, just to add some additional information coming from the U.S. And I think you mentioned it, but now the Syrian sanctions regulations has been officially removed from the Code of Federal Regulations in the U.S. But there's still some designations tied to the Bashar al-Assad regime, including al-Assad himself. But now these SDNs are designated under the Promoting Accountability for Assad and Regional Stabilization Sanctions Program. So it's a lot of delistings, but then anyone tied to al-Assad is still on the list, with this new program. And so, there's, as Luma mentioned, there's still some, I guess, ambiguity tied to Syria. And, the old regime aside, there's still a high concentration of SDNs in the region. So even though the US was very quick to remove these sanctions, there still is a slow start to any type of economic aid or economic development in Syria. But from what I hear, I think a lot of people are optimistic. They're just very cautious. So that's the big thing that's happening in the US sanctions wise right now. There are other big things happening in the US, but sticking with sanctions, I think the most notable in my view are the ICC designations that have been coming out in the past few weeks from OFAC. For those of you that aren't aware, OFAC created a new ICC program that targets people that are included in the investigation into Netanyahu's use of Israel government and military against the people of Gaza. And this is purely political and not anything else other than politics. So that these designations are kind of unique. And adding to their uniqueness, there are designations of EU people and one Canadian person. In total, there are now 13 ICC designations, 4 entities and 9 individuals, and there are there's a UK person on there, a couple EU, and like I said, a Canadian. And so this is another example of how the US is splintering off from EU and the rest of any unilateral agreement that's been coming ever since the new Trump administration has taken the White House. So, I don't see relations between the US and anyone really going in any other direction other than apart. I think the question is just how quickly can the US isolate itself? In terms of enforcement actions, there was one just last week. It's just a civil penalty against alleged violations against Venezuela and the Iran program. But other than that, my focus, I'm looking at the ICC designations and what's happening with Syria. Thanks, Louie.
Well, thanks, Andrew. And if we have time at the end, we'll have questions posed then. So let's keep moving on with the program. So next will be Ian. Over to you.
So it's for a summer period. It was relatively busy for the UK. So we had the announcement of, just at the beginning of the summer period, a new thematic sanctions regime and the sort of global migration regime. This is about trying to tackle illegal migration through going after the criminal gangs that are involved in sort of supporting illegal migration. It's I guess it's kind of debatable as to how effective it will be. It's sort of going after it's designating people for the purposes of asset freezes and travel bans. I think at one point there was a question as to whether they might be able to go after sort of some trade bans as well in terms of things like outboard motors, but I mean ultimately, it's rubber dinghies and motors. It's not particularly, and across the whole of the EU, I don't know where they would be targeting, but it does represent something of a first. It does also represent something of a first in terms of the G7 has also indicated that they're sort of interested in looking at this perspective as well. So something to be aware of and be conscious of. We've also seen sort of other action within a sort of more thematic area in terms of we've seen some cyber related designations going after some of the criminal gangs involved in cyber activities. Some of that's connected to Russia, some of it's connected to North Korea or wider just sort of ransomware attacks. Obviously, there's been continued use of sanctions on Russia in terms of designations, largely going after those sort of carrying out sort of the evasion activities, the sort of the wider evasion network, some of the vessels involved with breaching the oil price cap, things like that. Again, I guess that's a point of divergence that we were talking, that Andrew was talking about in terms of we're not really seeing that from the American side at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. There's a sort of broader examination of evasion issues as well. So some of that is very definitely connected to the Russia side, but we've had some guidance being up over the summer period with sort of key hotspots and places to look out for, third country sort of jurisdictions such as Vietnam, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, sort of various sort of known players, but still useful information to be put out there. I won't as ever go into too much detail on the enforcement side because I'll leave that to Mark. But there was a disclosure notice this week, which I'm going to just briefly mention because I kind of don't really think of it as enforcement action because it's kind of just the government going, hey, look, this was not right. And it was around CT stuff and moving swiftly. And it's just interesting to see because we promised this sort of year of enforcement action by sort of UK, EU authorities on and off for the past like 3 years, and I don't really see it. So it's an interesting one. But we also did see critically the sort of UK as part of the E3, so UK, France, and Germany, trigger the snapback mechanism for the Iran nuclear deal at the UN, which means that unless there is a Security Council resolution by the 28th of September, the UN sanctions that existed prior to the Iran nuclear deal, so the JCPOA, will come back into effect, and that will be sort of have effect for all UN member states, and so that's all 193 countries will be expected to implement and enforce those sanctions. Largely revolve around the sort of nuclear and ballistic missile sort of programs in Iran. There is some stuff around sort of shipping and oil, but it will be interesting to see as well the extent to which the sort of top-up sanctions that the EU previously had, the UK had, that went beyond those, might be brought back as well at the same time. And I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Ian. And yeah, so again, if anybody has questions for Ian, we'll save it to the end. So thank you again for that insight. And yeah, next on the docket is Mark. Over to you.
I was just going to wonder, Louie, if I maybe go after Aleksi, just because
Okay.
if he says things that I might say, then I don't need to say them.
Sure. All right. So Aleksi, you're up, sir.
Yeah, nothing from me. I'm not going to comment on any of the general EU or broader stuff that's been well covered. Just a few goings on from the Nordics. I think on a level of phenomenons, I think one of the things that everybody is getting antsy about is the welcome expanded use by the EU of designations going at third country circumventors. We saw the designations of the banks in China, the designations on the Indian refineries and all that. And I think we're seeing in Finland more and more of the EU going after bigger players in third countries, and there's going to be pushback from those third countries. We're seeing disputes bubbling under and all that. So that phenomenon, which is necessary to protect the effectiveness of EU sanctions, is going to have an increasing impact on the private sector level. Finland and the Nordic Baltic 8 group just issued a head of state level statement a week ago, pushing for further sanctions on circumventors and specifically mentioning China as a problem, which was something of a shift in tone, I believe, in the Nordic discourse. Some smaller stuff in Finland, we've continued to have frequent enforcement action. I think that the Finnish customs says that around 900 criminal investigations have been conducted in the sanctions violation in Finland since the beginning of the war. We saw there's a recent case, semi-large case involving maybe €500,000 worth of indirect exports to Russia, engines, other industrial equipment through third countries. I think they mentioned Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but also then mentioned that a lot of the stuff from Finland goes through Lithuania, Poland, and Bulgaria, sort of pointing a finger also at some of the partners and friends here in the EU. A curiosity, we had a case where a Finnish CEO used a defense where he was suspected of having attempted to export directly to Russia stuff that was sanctioned, and he said that he wasn't actually trying to do that. He was under contract to deliver some sanctioned goods to Russia, and the Russian party was pushing and saying they'll take it to court. So he decided to show them that it's not possible to declare for export sanctioned goods from Finland, and he made the declaration and got prosecuted. But the lower level court at least said that there was reasonable doubt as to what his actual intentions were. In Norway, I think the sanctions people have been talking about the Norwegian state fund that has reduced investments in some US companies, at least in Caterpillar, for their alleged involvement in what's going in Israel, and let's see what kind of a fight the Norwegians can can get with the Americans on that. Norwegians also opened a new licensing portal for sanctions licensing. And I had one more thing. Yeah, in Finland, we're seeing the Finnish Financial Supervisory Authority is continuing on their ongoing supervisory site visits for the specific purpose of monitoring sanctions compliance in Finnish large financial institutions. And what I'm hearing is that they are taking a relatively harsh position both on how they interpret what obligations banks have towards in terms of trying to prevent circumvention and similar activities by their clients and the interpretations that are attached to that. But that's a very quick recap of what's going on here in the north. So thanks, Louie.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Aleksi. Yeah, so Mark, back over to you.
Great. Well, I won't cover Syria because Luma's done that. I won't cover Iran because Ian's done that. The position with the UK and the EU is the same here. And as Ian said, it's uncertain whether the sort of gold-plated Iran sanctions that the EU had on top of the UN sanctions, what's going to happen with those, whether that's for a later day if they can't get to the negotiating table. But in the first instance, it'll just be the UN sanctions that snap back, if anything. So what I wanted to cover, other than what Aleksi's just done for Finland, which is very interesting, is a brief summary of the enforcement actions that have been going on in Europe just over the summer, just this summer. And this may take a while because there's been quite a lot, but I'll do it fairly high level. So just going alphabetically through the countries, so not ranking them. So starting with Bulgaria, 3 different sets of dawn raids in Bulgaria, one in conjunction with the German authorities, another in conjunction with the Lithuanian and Portuguese authorities, and another done off their own bat. So, quite a degree of enforcement activity in Bulgaria. In Czechia, this was back in June, investigations launched into 12 different companies this is after a sort of press expose into these 12 Czech companies exporting to Russia. The authorities commenced investigations into all 12 for, suspected sanctioned exports. In Denmark, a paint company has been raided, and the CEO, CFO, and the company have all been charged with sanctions offences for exporting paint to Russia. Estonia had a very active summer. Multiple criminal convictions obtained, a 6.5-year jail sentence, a 3-year jail sentence, a 2-year jail sentence. There's a lawyer who's been prosecuted for taking payment for the legal services from a designated person. This is not within the rubric of the asset freeze exception because the legal services were a third party, not for the designated person themselves. So that doesn't fall within the exception to the asset freeze. 23 violations identified in relation to sanctioned timber, and so on. Extraditing an Estonian national to the US to face charges there for exporting US origin goods to Russia. In Finland, we've heard from Aleksi. In France, the financial services regulator imposed a 600,000 euro fine for sanctions compliance failings. In Germany, again, this is all just over the summer. Multiple raids, especially in relation to export of luxury cars, seems to be the thing that the German authorities can really get their teeth into. On a smaller scale, perhaps slightly ridiculous scale, a raid in relation to the importation of Russian caviar shows the appetite. It's not going to help the war effort particularly, but it shows the appetite for enforcement is pretty remarkable. There was again, in relation to luxury car exports, a 5-year sentence handed out and 5 million euros confiscated, being the proceeds unlawfully obtained from those exports. In Greece, not always high on everyone's list of countries that are actively enforcing sanctions. An investigation was made public back in July in relation to alleged imports of sanctioned timber from Russia and Belarus. Again, a jurisdiction not always associated with sanctions compliance. Guernsey, one of the UK's offshore financial services jurisdictions. The financial services regulator there revoked licenses, imposed fines of £210,000 on both a firm and an individual. Similarly, in Iceland, their first ever sanctions enforcement action that I've ever seen, back in August, a fine for a bank there for sanctions compliance failings of 153,000 euros. In Italy, there were raids done on an Iranian company that was suspected of supporting the Russian military efforts. Jersey, again, not a hotspot for sanctions enforcement traditionally, but the Jersey authorities made a mutual legal assistance request to the Swiss authorities in relation to an ongoing investigation into possible sanctions breaches by Roman Abramovich and his companies, as well as historical corruption going back to Russia in the 1990s. But they're also investigating suspected transfers of assets in the immediate wake of Abramovich being designated and the continuing provision of financial services to Abramovich and his companies. Latvia, they announced that they had 91 confiscation proceedings to obtain the proceeds of crime, which means they must have obtained 91 criminal convictions, because otherwise you can't be confiscating the proceeds of crime. So that's pretty extraordinary. They announced back in June that they had commenced 61 new sanctions prosecutions so far this year. Lithuania, I've already mentioned the raids that were done in conjunction with the Bulgarian and Portuguese authorities, and the arrests were done in Lithuania. It was a fairly complicated export of machinery for the Russian oil and gas, water purifying machinery for the Russian oil and gas sector. Luxembourg, the financial services regulator, imposed a fine of 214,000 euros for sanctions compliance failings. Malta, again, not top on everyone's list of enforcing countries. 2 fines there. We don't know the size of the fines. It's just the way the Maltese publicise. The Dutch, been quite active over the summer. Just this week, a company that had been convicted of sanctions offences was put into compulsory liquidation by the court, which is, a nuclear weapon when it comes to enforcement, actually killing the company stone dead. People might remember this was the company where the staff were WhatsApping each other saying, we'll keep shipping to Russia until we go to jail. So it was a fairly egregious, institutionalized set of sanctions failings. So you can see why the court was minded to accede to the prosecution application to put the company into liquidation. And the directors were all given 3-year bans from acting as a director in any other company. A professional football team in the Netherlands was barred from playing in their leagues because of suspected ownership or control by a designated person, just taken out of the professional leagues altogether. So if you're a Vitesse Arnhem supporter, I'm very sorry, you no longer have a professional football team. A 3-year jail sentence was given to someone for sharing quite old kind of drone technology on a USB stick with Russians. The court was like, yeah, it's not the most up-to-date technology, but it still falls within banned prohibition of technology transfer. It's one of the few examples of a prosecution of the transfer of technology as opposed to a good. It was software, it was blueprints and designs. So interesting to see that. Portugal, again, not high on people's lists of sanctions enforcing jurisdictions. There were the raids that were done in conjunction with the Bulgarians and Lithuanians, and on my blog I put out 3 judgments from the Lisbon Court of Appeal that I found that all revealed ongoing criminal investigations in Portugal. So there's more activity going on under the surface there than you might think. Just this week or last week, court judgment confirming pre-trial detention of an individual, a Georgian national suspected of exporting machinery to Russia, investigations into alleged exports of machinery to Russia, alleged imports of Russian fuel, alleged imports of Russian and Belarusian timber. So quite a lot of enforcement over the summer in Spain. Sweden, investigation into use of funds by Pravfond, which is like a Russian propaganda vehicle that's designated by the EU. The Swiss, I was able to get from SECO 13 the judgments for 13 administrative penalties imposed by SECO under the Swiss sanctions. They're all low-level fines, all low-level misconduct and breaches, but some interesting points in there nonetheless in seeing the Swiss being fairly active. And then as Ian mentioned, and there's been some enforcement in the UK, the first convictions under the UK's Russian sanctions. There's been another conviction of an individual who was a designated person who was charged with failing to provide financial information on themselves to OFSI. So they were convicted. Law firm that was fined, wait for it, £600 for breaching license terms. So that will tell that law firm. OFSI fine of 300,000, fine of 1.1 million, and so on. So it's a pretty lengthy catalogue. Hopefully that didn't get too boring and repetitive. But for a 3-month period over a summer when everyone in Europe's supposed to be on holiday, that's pretty extraordinary. It's 20 countries plus Jersey and Guernsey. It's nearly 10 million euros in fines and confiscations. It's nearly 20 years of jail time. It's a pretty extraordinary level of enforcement for those of us who can remember what enforcement looked like pre-2022. It's quite remarkable, really. So,
Yeah, thank you for that,
I'll
Mark.
finish there.
No, for sure. I mean, from my seat, I saw it quite busy, but you summarizing it, it's like, wow. Especially like you said, the countries that were involved who are not really big players in the scene, they're becoming more active. I would hope that the UK starts slapping the wrist a bit harder and not some of these kind of petty fines, but I guess progress is progress.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I'm usually pretty quick to damn the UK for fairly lackluster enforcement by the likes of OFSI and HMRC, but it's worth just the UK's financial services regulator, the FCA, has imposed more sanctions fines than the rest of Europe put together since 2017. So there's one body in the UK that knows how to write zeros at the end of a check when it comes to fines.
Right, and I think based on everything you said, but also recent reports out of Europe about certain countries deciding to put sanctions on Israel and certain ministers that are part of the administration, I think will be interesting to see how that develops, and that I guess would be part of our next update next month to see how that looks.
Yeah, I mean, it's Poland and some of the Baltic states have had their own sanctions in relation to Russia over and above what the EU's done. The UK, I think, was back in 2010, 2011, had Iran sanctions because they were pissed off that the EU was moving too slowly. So they put some sanctions on the Iran financial services sector and then dropped them once the EU caught up 6 months later. So there've been member states in the EU that have gone on their own path a little bit, and Israel may be the next one in the target for some member states. I mean, Spain's had an arms embargo on Israel for about a year now. So I think that is an area where there'll be movement.
Great point. All right. So at this point of the webinar, are there any questions from the audience to our expert panel? Please raise your hand and I'll call on you. If not, we could continue with wrapping things up. I see Luma's back. So thanks for popping back in.
No, I was listening.
Okay.
But I thought I'll come on back online in case
Nice.
there was something specific. I need to drop off at 12.
Gotcha. Okay, so I don't see any hands yet. So I guess my question to the panelists, including you, of course, Luma, and we could maybe go in the order that we spoke, or we could just have a quick conversation. But what final remarks do you think you have for this panel, for this, I guess, webinar, being kind of the summing up the summer and September a bit? What would you want to leave people with to keep in mind until we catch up again next month? Any key points you want to call out? So Luma, starting with you.
Yeah, I think for summer, it's definitely been a busy one. I think with all the high-speed churn, sanctions has always been a very quick turnaround regime. You would wake up and suddenly a whole country has been designated depending on how things unfold. But even in unlike say financial AML and others where you have a registration and a very nice long lead before you get to a conclusion, so much more preparedness. I think the one thing, if anything, this summer and even this whole year, I would say, is that the volatility and the speed of change seem to kind of almost going to be the norm. And what we see and what I have active conversation with day in, day out is, are we built as institutions to be able to tolerate that level of churn? If you think of our governance cycle, how quickly does it take us to update a country risk rating model? Even our screening solution, where you're basically massively throwing in 500 entities on, 500 entities off, that will have knock-on effect from often our operational side, from your training side. So we kind of almost need to think more strategically around how to build that greater agility in how we think and how we react and how we operate, because I think the world that we're living in is moving much, much quicker. And some of the things that we never thought could happen are happening. I think there was a point around potentially
Exactly.
Israel being the next designation, or the amount of work that needs to be thought about, this very strong commercial and business relationship. How would that unfold? China, we didn't touch upon that, but that kind of mumbles up and down. That was a scary military parade a couple of weeks ago. But again, that will be Russia times 100. So yeah, it's that unfortunately the speed and churn is going to be the norm, and we really need to pause and think how we can respond more effectively.
That's a great point, and I would throw into the complexity of sanctions compliance is that now we're also expected to be trade compliance officers and export control experts, which was not the case a few years ago. So definitely, I agree with you that the key is also training to make sure that we can stay on top of everything that we need to and we're expected to. Cool. Andrew, have any pearls of wisdom to share and we'll wrap things up?
Definitely just want to echo what Luma says. She put it beautifully, and that's definitely what is going to happen. There's the volatility is here to stay, and it's just going to ramp up. So we definitely have to be vigilant.
Thank you, Andrew. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, echo all of those points. I think China is going to be a real focus as we go on for the rest of the year, because it kind of feels like we're in that pre-Russia invasion space where there was like this kind of concept that the US was going to focus on China. It feels like we're in that space again. The EU, UK has a very different relationship with China, as do many other countries around the world. So that will be interesting to see how it plays out, develops. The Iran stuff, I don't think it can be underestimated, like how much, although in theory, the UN regime is quite limited, like it does ramp things back up again in a substantial way for us to pay attention again. It is another fairly comprehensive regime that would suddenly be back on our cards again. And then I think it's worth mentioning that we're very focused often on sort of Western sanctions, on EU sanctions, UK sanctions, US sanctions. But actually, there are more and more players starting to use sanctions all the time. We're seeing China use sanctions. It wouldn't be beyond the realms that if lots of countries start using sanctions on Israel, they would potentially use sanctions back. The interconnectivity and the origins of parts and products and software will make that sort of journey increasingly difficult to manage, I think, if that's the sort of trajectory that we end up in.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Aleksi, anything you would like to share?
Yeah. Wiser people have said wiser things. I would have mentioned something along the lines that Ian said. I think that's a valuable point. I think the only thing, and maybe this was touched upon while I was having technical difficulties, is just a very simple thing of also looking at what will come in terms of additional sanctions on Russia. There's a 19th package of EU sanctions already in preparation, but I think the news of last will have an impact on the powerfulness of measures, maybe not in this round, but the future ones. Mr. Ambassador O'Sullivan is currently in Washington, which may be a sign of something. So what's going to come, whether Trump's patience is finally running thin enough to see something further. So even in these very simple things of just looking at at what comes, the direct implications in addition to all the more complex things that the others already touched upon, but nothing else from me. So thanks.
Thanks, Aleksi. And Mark?
Yeah, I think for me, I think we'd all been to the funeral for UN sanctions several times over the last few years, and it'll be remarkable if the Iran UN regime comes back in 18 days or whatever it is. There are players in the Middle East who've been assisting Russia with circumvention who are very anti-Iran for different geopolitical and religious reasons. Dubai historically was one of the few Middle Eastern states that had a track record of enforcing UN sanctions against Iran and actually sending people to jail. And so it'd be really interesting to see the Dubai split personality when it comes to Iran and Russia. And the EU, I think, now has a different attitude to sanctions than perhaps used to be the case. Italy, for a long time, never implemented the EU sanctions against Iran into Italian law. They just never did it. Post-2007, they just never did it. And a lot of member states now have different mechanisms for adopting EU regulations into domestic law. And so you'll see, for almost the first time ever, a real Iran sanctions regime in Italy. Because previously it just didn't exist. It was at the EU level, but not at the Italian level. So I think the revival of a serious UN sanctions regime will have a number of impacts.
Awesome. Thank you for that summary, Mark. So yeah, as we're a bit over time, I just want to thank everyone again from our panel of experts and our special guests for joining us today and sharing such great and relevant information. Again, thank you to all who have joined live or who plan to watch the recording afterwards. Remember to become a member. That was a bit of a tongue tie. At nfcp.info. If you don't follow us already, please follow us on LinkedIn. Also, if you're interested in speaking to any of our panel of experts, please reach out to them on LinkedIn. They're very nice. They don't bite. And as far as what we do at NFCP and also these monthly updates, please tell a friend. Word of mouth is a great thing. And also, we welcome your feedback. So let us know if there's anything that you would like for us to cover. If you like these sessions specifically, these sanctions monthly updates, any suggestions for further webinars, events, thought leadership pieces, et cetera. Because the bottom line is we exist for you, for the community. So please let your voices be heard. And, we'll try our best to accommodate as much as we can. And then almost last thoughts here. So shout out to Andrew for completing 4 years in Denmark. So kudos to you. I know he just dropped off the call, but a good accomplishment there. And also happy birthday to my dad. So I love you if you're listening. If not, wishes for you in Florida. And yeah, so I like to end our meetings on a bit of a quote. And so as I was preparing for this webinar, I came across a quote. It's actually a magnet in our kitchen that I felt was very relevant for this time, and it's a quote by Anne Frank, and the quote is, "How wonderful it is that no one has to wait even a minute to start gradually changing the world." So let that sink in to you guys in our community. So until next time, be well. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for the panel of experts, and have a great day and rest of the week. Cheers.
Thank you.